I'd like to talk about one of my favorite Five Nights at Freddy's characters. One who has been hinted and teased at coming to the games, but hasn't, at least not yet. One antagonist that I believe Scott has been rebooting, along with the Fazbear Fright series, and setting up to make their way to come to the games, as well as someone that I believe will end up being the next big antagonist of the series in the future, after the Mimic. She was the big bad in the Frights books, and I really think she has the real potential to become one of the best antagonists of the series, if her story is redone or rebooted to fit the games in a better way, as well as further fleshed out and done right this time. The first Five Nights at Freddy's game I ever really played and got into was Sister Location when it came out, so of course my all-time favorite character in the games has always been Circus Baby. She was a superb villain in Sister Location, being one of the best villains in the series before she became William Afton's lackey and helper in Pizzeria Simulator and the Silver Eyes trilogy. She always had the potential to be such a wonderful and mysterious villain, with her own motives as well as her own agenda. I think that's what made her so unpredictable, as well as such a great villain in Sister Location, and to a lesser extent in the Fourth Closet. I mean, despite just being a helper to her father with daddy issues, she was a good parallel and antagonist for Charlie herself. I've always wondered, though, how things would have gone if Circus Baby went out on her own, if she just left or didn't care about her father at all and just became her own antagonist with her own plans after separating from Ennard. But, alas, she ended up becoming Scrap Baby, who had a really cool and terrifying design, but who ended up becoming just a lackey to help her father in Pizzeria Simulator. I honestly think the complaints about Circus Baby in Pizzeria Simulator, as well as the Silver Eyes trilogy, was what eventually led Scott to the creation of Eleanor, a scarier, more mature, more evil and sadistic Circus Baby-like animatronic that was this time more disconnected from the Aftons, as a way of separating her from Elizabeth and William Afton and becoming her own villain. As most people might remember, Circus Baby thought the main character in Sister Location was her father. Yet, despite that, she still went out of her way to deceive, scoop, kill him, and even wear his skin at the end, thus proving that she didn't really seem to care about him at all before being kicked out of Ennard. After that, she seemed to do a complete 180, suddenly wanting to become her father's sidekick, along with trying to help him kill more kids in Pizzeria Simulator. I honestly think Scott heard the complaints about the sudden shift in character between Circus Baby and Scrap Baby, as well as her lackluster reception in the Fourth Closet novel. I think he realized that people preferred Circus Baby as a more morally ambiguous, mysterious, and manipulative, deceiving character in Sister Location with her own agenda and motives. So I think that's why he created Eleanor for the Fazbear Frights novels. I also think the reason he released these as a novel series was actually because he wanted to test the waters to see how these stories, ideas, and characters, especially Eleanor herself, would be received, in order to see if maybe he could eventually bring some of these stories or characters to the game's timeline, or create a new game based on them, like he did with Into the Pit. But before we get into that, let's take a step back for a minute and go over the obligatory summary of Eleanor, her character, her story, as well as the epilogues from the Fazbear Frights books. If you already know this, then please skip here to get to the next part. For those unfamiliar with Fazbear Frights, Eleanor was an animatronic that was first introduced in the second story of the first Fazbear Frights novel called To Be Beautiful. Her design was essentially a new or alternative take on Circus Baby, only much more slender and thinner, resembling more of a doll with red pigtails along with pink cheeks instead of red, a long neck as well as long metallic arms and legs, and an impossibly wide grin with long, sharp, jagged teeth. After being found in a junkyard and taken home by a girl named Sarah, Eleanor is activated and gives Sarah a heart-shaped pendant to help grant Sarah's wish to become more beautiful. The pendant is made of Remnant, a manifestation of memories and soul energy in the form of a metallic liquid that can bind souls to inanimate objects to bring them to life or infuse them with paranormal abilities. Remnant and its dark negative form, Agony, is one of the main reasons why the animatronics are haunted in the series, and because this pendant is charged with it, it can change a person's appearance, allowing them to shapeshift or create illusions that other people can see. At first, this pendant seems to grant Sarah her wish, making Sarah appear more beautiful each day, but when it falls off, the illusion fades, and the terrible truth is revealed, as Sarah's body suddenly begins slowly turning into junk and scrap metal. Sarah makes her way home to confront Eleanor, but is horrified to find her own body parts strewn around the garage in a pile of gore. Apparently, each night when Sarah went to sleep, Eleanor would get to work, secretly experimenting on Sarah by cutting off and replacing all of her body parts and limbs with junk and scrap metal. With the truth now known, Sarah collapses into a pile of scrap metal and is helpless to do anything as her new body falls apart and she sadly dies. Eleanor then shapeshifts into Sarah, assuming her identity and leaving her. Later on in the series, in the Stitch Wraith epilogues of each of the books, Eleanor is revealed to be the main antagonist, being behind most of the tragic events and stories in the book, revealing that she is a shape-shifting, chaotic creature of pure evil, possibly even some kind of demonic entity, completely made up of Agony, the dark and negative version of Remnant that's made up of human pain, trauma, and suffering. It is actually Eleanor who is causing these events to feed off of, as well as to collect human suffering, agony, and Remnant to make herself much more powerful. She is defeated later on by the Stitch Wraith, including Jake along with Detective Larson, but a similar pendant is later seen in the Tales from the Pizzaplex story called Frailty. Frailty seems to be a new retelling or a new take on To Be Beautiful, which focuses on Jessica this time, yet another victim of Eleanor who was turned to scrap metal, but this time is still alive because she is still wearing the pendant made out of Remnant. This time, Eleanor is not around, but Jessica decides to use the Remnant-fueled pendant to help sick people by shaving off pieces of the pendant onto people to cure them. And she eventually sacrifices herself to use the last of the pendant to help save the life of a dying girl. After this, it appears that Eleanor, as well as the pendant that Jessica uses, are both gone. Now, I know some people think the Frailty is a continuation of Fazbear Frights, so if the Tales from the Pizzaplex books are canon, then it possibly means that Fazbear Frights would also be canon to the main game's timeline, which essentially also means that the pendant and Eleanor are gone, and thus won't be coming back at all. But I actually see it in a different way. I honestly think that Frailty is a remake or sort of opposite retelling of To Be Beautiful, but in a different way, redone to fit into the game's current timeline with the rest of the Tales from the Pizzaplex. After all, it's unclear if this is indeed the same pendant that Eleanor uses in the Frights novels, since the pendant Eleanor uses turns clear, indicating there's no more Remnant inside it at all, and is given by Dr. Talbot to Detective Larson for safekeeping. It is very possible that the pendant that Jessica had is yet another copy that Eleanor possibly made and gave to her, like she did with Sarah. We know that Eleanor does seem to be able to make copies of this pendant in Fazbear Frights, but even if this was the same pendant, having this pendant in the Tales from the Pizzaplex novels still doesn't really confirm that Frights and the Stitch Wraith stingers are canon, or that Eleanor is dead in the game's timeline. It really only means that Remnant, Eleanor, and another pendant were around, that she has done the same thing to other people like Jessica, but it also brings into question if Eleanor and more of these pendants might still exist or be around somewhere. It really doesn't confirm one way or the other that Fazbear Frights is canon. It just proves that these Remnant pendants exist, and that Eleanor can do the same thing she did to Sarah to other people like Jessica in the Tales books. It also confirms that Remnant is still around and is still a powerful substance capable of powering as well as possibly doing a lot more than we initially thought. But then the question becomes, why would Scott actually create a story about another victim of Eleanor, along with a Remnant-powered pendant? If Eleanor and the pendant aren't coming back in some way, why not just end it at Fazbear Frights, so Frights could be its own separate story that is completely done and over with. Like, why bring in yet another victim of Eleanor's with a similar pendant to Sarah, since Eleanor was already defeated and is gone? In fact, why even have the pendant come back at all when we already know that it turned clear and was given to Detective Larson by Talbert, rendering it useless and gone for good? So for me, it seems like the only logical reason why Scott would do this is if Frailty is not a continuation of Fazbear Frights like most people think, but is actually instead a reboot or retelling of To Be Beautiful, this time taking place in the main game's timeline, that sets up and shows that Eleanor, her pendants, Remnant, and its negative counterpart Agony are still around, that they are still important to the Tales from the Pizzaplex book's continuity, and could very well come to the main games as well. In fact, She's Always Nervous, one of my favorite newer FNAF theorists, recently came out with a super interesting and fun theory that goes further into the idea of the Pizzaplex as well as the Vanny Mask somehow being powered or made by Remnant and possibly even Agony as well. She brings up a lot of really good points on Frailty about how Remnant and Agony could still play a huge role in not just the Pizzaplex but also the glam rock animatronics, even suggesting that Fazbear Entertainment or someone working for or with them might have been using Remnant and Agony to power the Pizzaplex. I really like this theory and I'd highly recommend checking it out if you haven't. It really made me wonder that if Remnant and Agony are more important to the Pizzaplex along with Fazbear Entertainment, then maybe Eleanor is also involved in or behind this as well. She could even be using the Pizzaplex to build up as well as collect more Remnant and Agony for herself. But we'll get more into this a little later. Let's just move on for now. Since the release of the Fazbear Frights books, along with the newer Tales from the Pizzaplex books, many fans were left wondering if these books, the characters, and the events in them were canon to the games or not. While it seems like the Mimic, as well as the stories in the Tales from the Pizzaplex, might actually be canon to the games now, with the recent Help Wanted 2 update and the upcoming Secret of the Mimic game, it still remains doubtful as to whether the stories from the Fazbear Frights, as well as the overarching Stitch Rate Stingers epilogues featuring Eleanor, will become canon to the games as well, at least not in its currently written state. I've started noticing an increasing amount of clues, hints, and breadcrumbs that Scott has been leaving that seems to be suggesting that Eleanor might actually be making her way to the game's timeline. And with her appearance in the release of the Return to the Pit interactive novel, as well as most of those interactive novels being confirmed as taking place in the game's timeline, I think it's becoming clear that Scott might very well be rebooting the story of Eleanor, as well as attempting to bring Eleanor to the game's universe, but in a completely redone and more fleshed out way. The first time we saw hints of Eleanor in the games was a few years ago when Security Breach got delayed. Scott released a side-scrolling beat-em-up game called Security Breach: Fury's Rage. Fans were quick to notice that in the background of one of the final levels for the game, under the Pizzaplex, we actually see a silhouette of Eleanor in a test tube. Now, of course we know this game was just a silly game Scott made for fun, so it wasn't canon, and was just a cameo at the time, so it was easily dismissed. But it would not be the last time we would see clues or hints for Eleanor. The next time we saw, or in this case, heard Eleanor, was with the release of the game version of the story Into the Pit, from the first Fazbear Frights novel made by Mega Cat Studios. At the time, actually having a story taken from the Fazbear Frights books and being remade into a game was huge, because it hinted at the very real possibility that Scott might actually bring some of the stories or possibly characters from the Fazbear Frights series to the game's universe and timeline, but also remade or reimagined in a new way to better fit into the game's timeline, as well as the game's continuity and lore. Still, as most FNAF fans know, it's never simple with Scott. So just because we have Mega Cat Studios making some of the Fazbear Fright series into games, that doesn't automatically mean that Mega Cat's games are canon to the main game's timeline. In fact, Mega Cat Studios' Into the Pit game, along with any other games they make, could very well be in their own separate timeline, completely unconnected to the main game's timeline. On top of that, even if Scott had some of the Fazbear Fright stories made into games or brought over to the main games and the main game's timeline, it did not necessarily mean that Eleanor herself would ever come to the games or even be mentioned at all, since the stories can also work as separate, standalone stories without Eleanor and the Stitch Rate Stingers plotline. I think that's why the biggest surprise for me, the one clue that most people overlook, was the launch trailer for Into the Pit. This wasn't an early trailer for the game that came out a year ahead of the game's release, like what happened with Security Breach. This was a launch trailer that released the very same day the game came out. When it came out, most people were either too busy playing the game to react to it, but the launch trailer for Into the Pit gave possibly the biggest clue yet of Eleanor coming to the games. Though, whether it be to the main game's timeline, or just in Mega Cat's own separate game universe based on the Fazbear Fright stories, we still don't know, and is pretty much up for debate. During the trailer, though, we actually hear the voice of Eleanor speaking and talking, and we know it's Eleanor because she specifically mentions about wishes coming true, and granting wishes is what she does with Sarah, granting her wish to be beautiful, but with horrible consequences. In the trailer, she says,
"What do you wish for most?"
Welcome to Running Fazbear, a magical place for kids and grown-ups alike, where fantasy and fun come to life.
You may think you know the answer. But what will your deepest desires cost? Survive long enough to make your wish come true.
Now, I must admit, I squealed a little when I heard this, because for me, it was the first real big hint or clue that Scott might actually be bringing some version of Eleanor to the games. And I would absolutely love to see her story and villain arc come to the games, but this time in a completely reimagined and much better way, without the Stitch Wraith or other characters making the plot needlessly more convoluted and rushed, like Dr. Talbert, Detective Larson, not to mention Andrew, the Fazbear Frights' Cassidy stand-in. It was especially exciting to me that she actually had a voice with speaking lines, because it seemed to hint at the very real possibility that maybe we'd see Eleanor come to the games, and not just copied from the books, but a new version of Eleanor, someone who could become a better, more capable and sinister version of Circus Baby without Elizabeth's spirit helping her father or just being a lackey or a side villain. Someone who could actually become a far better female antagonist with her own fleshed out motives and backstory, since we don't know much about her aside from what we know in Fazbear Frights, which Scott could reboot or reimagine in a completely new way to fit the game's current timeline and characters after the events of Security Breach, Ruin, and the current arc with the Mimic. She is someone that is technically a blank slate for Scott, Mega Cat Studios, and Steel Wool to reboot, start over, and fully flesh out her character in a new, more terrifying and better way, with her own plans and motives, and is someone that could be the perfect next main villain to set up after the Mimic. The trailer wasn't the only time we had an appearance from Eleanor from the Into the Pit game either. Although I haven't played it myself yet, we also got a To Be Beautiful minigame featuring the sprite of Eleanor collecting and giving body parts to Sarah. It's even been theorized that the spring Bonnie that hunts down Aldwell during Into the Pit could either be Eleanor herself in disguise, or could possibly even be one of Eleanor's creations, which is actually an interesting idea, seeing as most of the other incidents in the Fazbear Frights books are confirmed to be caused by her in some way or another, since she can shapeshift. Interestingly enough though, her sprite in the Into the Pit game more closely resembles her Circus baby counterpart even more, instead of the more accurate book description that the graphic novel used for her design. And I'm pretty sure that Scott had to probably approve this model for Mega Cat Studios to actually use in the game itself. Since the success of Mega Cat Studios' Into the Pit game, Scott, along with the developers themselves, have confirmed that they will be taking some of the other stories from the Fazbear Frights novels, such as Fetch, and turning them into their own games as well. But they haven't said one way or another if Mega Cat Studios games will be canon to the main games, or if they are their own separate timeline and universe. So right now, we pretty much have to assume that Mega Cat Studios' Into the Pit game is not confirmed to be canon to the main game series, and is probably its own separate timeline for now. Even so, Scott does seem open to the possibility of remaking or retelling these stories in a new way, possibly rebooting and changing them to better fit into the game's canon events and bringing them to the main game's timeline. This has become more relevant recently with Scott's newer Five Nights at Freddy's interactive novels, the events of which are mostly confirmed to be in the game's continuity and timeline, with its first two novels, VIP and The Week Before, both taking place leading up to Security Breach and the first FNAF game. One of the recent interactive novels is the Return to the Pit story, which seems to be yet another remake or retelling of the Into the Pit story, but this time seems to be set in the game's universe, redone and rewritten in a way to fit in more with the main game's continuity and timeline. I was eagerly awaiting this novel in the hopes that there might be some mention of Eleanor, but Eleanor, or at least a seemingly new version of her, does indeed seem to make a huge appearance during one of the endings, which seems to make her canon and confirm her appearance in the main game's universe. If you escape Spring Bonnie, following the sounds of a little girl's voice calling for help down the alley and into a cellar, Oswald comes across a toy doll in the shape and size of a little girl with red pigtails, wearing a red dress with long bone white metallic arms and legs, this time with more of a clown-like appearance, with a red nose and red cheeks instead of pink, more similar to the description of Circus Baby. She is silent as Oswald approaches, but then he begins hearing high-pitched giggles as Spring Bonnie appears behind him. And then she turns her head to Oswald to watch as Spring Bonnie kills him, which actually seems to give some evidence to support the theory that Eleanor is indeed working with or controlling Spring Bonnie somehow. And before you say it, yes, I know that some people, including Tom in the game theory video, have already speculated this to be Plush Baby instead of Eleanor, but I disagree, since Eleanor is explicitly described as a doll in both To Be Beautiful and in Return to the Pit, not as a plushie. The description even mentions that she appears to be a toy doll resembling the shape of a little girl, and a small child is way bigger than a plushie. Also, the doll has red hair this time, not orange hair like the plush babies. We also already know that Eleanor can shapeshift as well, and since Oswald is a 10-year-old boy, it only makes sense that Eleanor would choose to take the form of a doll in the shape of a little girl that is roughly the same size and age as Oswald. I also think that if Scott wanted us to know that it was Plush Baby, why not say it's a plushie? Why specify it as a toy doll resembling a little girl, and one that seems so similar to Eleanor's description? But even more to the point, why would Scott even give us this description and appearance in Return to the Pit if it was just meant to be an Easter egg or a cameo? He knows most people will immediately recognize her description to be similar to Eleanor, and that this will spark major discussion among the fans as to whether this is confirmation of Eleanor possibly existing in the game's canon timeline as well. But regardless, I don't know about you guys, but to me this seems to majorly hint that Eleanor is being set up to come to the game's timeline as well, especially if Return to the Pit is considered canon, like the other two previous interactive novels are. Another big point towards this book actually being canon and in the game's continuity is the fact that this novel seems to go out of its way to rewrite and change some of the events of the Into the Pit story to better fit into the previous main game's timeline and events. Instead of there being 6 missing children being murdered, like in the original Into the Pit story and game, it's changed to 5 kids this time, essentially erasing Andrew. since he was just a Cassidy stand-in and is not really present in the continuity of the main game's timeline, and seemingly confirming Cassidy to be both the fifth and final missing child victim in Golden Freddy, with curly black hair, as well as being the receiver of the Happiest Day minigame. This actually matches up more with the logbook and the main game's timeline of having 5 children for the missing child's incident instead of 6, as well as Charlie the puppet and the bite victim, aka the crying child. Like he did with the week before and VIP, I think Scott is tying up some loose ends and also confirming or answering some lingering questions from the main game's timeline that have remained unanswered and up for debate for a lot of fans, who up until now have only had to rely on the books and figuring out who or what are parallels to help shed some light on or explain some of the events in the game's timeline. It also confirms that the 2 spirits in Golden Freddy are both Cassidy, aka the vengeful spirit, who is both the 5th and final missing child, and the crying child, aka the younger brother of Michael Afton. It also clears up that while Happiest Day is for the bite victim, he is not the one receiving it at the end of the table. It is Cassidy, the vengeful spirit, that is receiving it for him, since she is the second spirit that inhabits Golden Freddy and the main one in control. The crying child is the second spirit in Golden Freddy, but he can't do much. He isn't in control of it, at least not as much as Cassidy is. If anything, Return to the Pit finally seems to confirm that the Happiest Day event is for the crying child's benefit, to help him and the other missing children's victims to move on. Cassidy is also there at the end of the table to complete it on both the crying child's and her behalf. It's the crying child's memory, but essentially all 5 of the missing child incident kids are needed for it to free both him and them. Not only is Scott tying up loose ends for the main game's continuity, but I also believe he is leaving breadcrumbs, hints, and possibly even setting up who the next main villain will be after the Mimic. I think he's going to set up and have Eleanor come to the game's timeline in a completely new way and flesh her out a lot more this time. Honestly, if we look back on what Scott's been doing over the last year, it seems like he is actually trying to answer some of the bigger questions and clear up some of the old misconceptions and confusion regarding some of the past events and characters in this franchise. I mean, just look at 5 Laps at Freddy's, the interactive novels, and Steel Wool's upcoming Secret of the Mimic game. Scott used 5 Laps at Freddy's to end the debate and clear up once and for all who the orange guy was in the Midnight Motorist game in Pizzeria Simulator. He used the week before to clear up what happened to Ralph, aka Phone Guy, shortly before the events of FNAF 1, which also seemed to indicate that the vengeful spirit inside Golden Freddy is female and Cassidy. With the release of Return to the Pit now, he has seemingly confirmed the 5 children from the missing children's incident, with Cassidy being the 5th child and the vengeful spirit, as well as the receiver of the Happiest Day minigame to help the crying child move on. Now, after Midnight Motorist, Phone Guy, Golden Freddy, and the Happiest Day, what is one of the biggest questions that have never been fleshed out or further explored much in the game's continuity? You'd probably say the events leading up to the missing children's incident and the creation of Fazbear Entertainment with the whole Fall Fest. And you'd be right, of course, which is why we're getting Secret of the Mimic. But what other main game has been the hardest to place in the timeline and has had the most mysterious characters that have never been fully fleshed out or explored? Its sister location, and Circus Babies and Rentals. We all know how Elizabeth Afton was killed and that she possessed Circus Baby. But when was she killed? What happened with William after that? Was she killed before or after her brother, the bite victim? Why did Afton build the Fun Times and Circus Baby to kidnap children? Were they infused with the souls of the dead children's incident? In fact, why build sister location in a secret bunker underneath his house? Who was he experimenting with the nightmares and the gas on? Was it Michael or the crying child? We know the crimes of Afton, sure, and what happens to his children, but we don't really know much else about these events. And I think Scott is going to somehow bring Eleanor into the main game's timeline as the next major villain to fully explore and answer a lot of these questions. Now, I realize some people might not like Eleanor and how she was handled in the Stitch Rate Stingers epilogues, and that's fair, honestly. I agree, she was done wrong in those books. But I think she has a lot lot of potential to be reimagined and revamped in a whole new and better way for the games. I think most people can agree that the biggest downside of the Fazbear Frights books was that they were rushed, especially the Stitch Race Stinger epilogues, which were tacked on at the end of each book and were not really fully fleshed out enough. It seemed obvious that Scott and the writers were rushed and tried to incorporate so many characters and their stories into the epilogues. We had Jake, Andrew, Detective Larson, Dr. Talbert and his daughter Rennell, and Eleanor, so they couldn't really flesh them out or expand upon them much at all. They didn't have time to expand on Eleanor and her story, to flesh out her personality or backstory, give her motives, or really allow us to see more of her personality. Aside from appearing in To Be Beautiful, she had no real lore or setup. She was just suddenly revealed to be the one behind everything, with no clever hints to build it up or a good setup. I mean, yes, the twist was surprising and a pretty cool twist, but it was executed poorly, and it didn't make sense with some of the stories and the events that happened in them, probably in part because Scott had different writers working on all the different stories. So the stories didn't really match up, and the continuity didn't really work when you reread or looked back on those stories, knowing that Eleanor was somehow behind them. If this had been fleshed out or set up with more hints or clues throughout the books, then it would have been so much better. Now personally, I honestly love the concept behind Eleanor. She is probably one of the most powerful, dangerous, and evil characters in the FNAF universe. She is an agony demon creature and the embodiment of all the pain, suffering, and tragedies caused by William Afton that has happened over the years, but also a byproduct of Afton's evil that was left to collect, to fester, thriving off negative emotions and feelings, eventually outgrowing and leaving him behind and becoming a much more powerful and stronger demonic creature hungry for more pain and suffering. The problem with this though is that she wasn't fleshed out any further. Like, she had no backstory, no charisma, no real personality, and her motives weren't really fleshed out aside from the usual wanting power and immortality, which was boring because it was just so similar to Afton in the Silver Eyes trilogy. So you essentially have this really cool and interesting concept for a villain completely made out of Agony and or Remnant, but they don't really expand upon it, and as a result end up rushing the epilogues, making her into a stereotypical surprise villain hungry for more suffering, immortality, and power. There was so much that Scott could have done with this character, and so much he could still do with her character if he decides to reboot her and brings her over to the game's timeline. Scott could lean more into the horror and agony aspects of Eleanor, further exploring her being a demonic creature made out of agony, and how a creature like that would come to life, how she would think, how she would act or feel, what her motivations and personality might be like or would develop into. He could expand upon how she is a demon made out of pure agony, and how most of the creations of agony came from her or are connected or linked to her through agony, as well as how she possibly controls them. She doesn't even need to be involved with Afton or his family. I mean, she can still be relevant and somewhat connected to him, having been made from all the evil and agony he created, but also having used him to create more suffering and tragedy to feed and grow stronger from before leaving and going off on her own, distancing herself from him and continuing to scheme, as well as having her own plans. I know a lot of people have problems with them using the illusion discs, pendants made out of remnants, and the less said about Fazgoo the better. So perhaps Scott could change this. He could keep it more grounded, but could also focus on the supernatural effects of her. Instead of just shape-shifting, since she's a shadow demon, maybe she could leave her body and possess other people at will. Or, if you want to link her to Afton's murders even further, perhaps Eleanor might have been the one manipulating or messing with William and Henry, possessing or shape-shifting into different family members, perhaps even being responsible for William's descent into madness and leading him to commit the murders. Maybe she tortured and haunted the Afton family, manipulating William Afton to become a killer, along with causing more suffering and agony to feed off of. If Scott wants her to be separate from the Aftons, though, then he could lean into her being a demon that was formed and created out of agony, who, like most demons, have the power to shapeshift or possess anyone they want. She could have charisma, her own style, a bit of wit and audacity, giving her a more manipulative and sinister but charming and fun personality that would make her both scary as well as fun to watch. On the flip side though, if Scott wanted her to be connected to William Afton or Elizabeth Afton, then perhaps she could be a creature made from Elizabeth Afton's Agony, but became so power hungry for Agony to the point where she needs it to become more powerful. This would also make sense as to why Eleanor betrays William and leaves Elizabeth's circus baby and becomes her own entity, simply because she doesn't need them anymore and wants her own power. They could even have the Mimic arc end up being connected to her, along with setting her up to be the next big bad after the Mimic. Both the Mimic and Eleanor are beings fueled by and made of Agony, so it would not surprise me if Scott brought in the Mimic to further explain the concept of Agony and Remnant as a way to delve back into the past, taking us back to the beginning of how everything got started before eventually setting up and bringing Eleanor to the games. Perhaps Eleanor was the one that ended up possessing Vanessa, or was Vanny herself, a separate entity that was created from all the Agony and Remnant that the Vanny mask and the Pizzaplex was powered by, because Eleanor was using the Pizzaplex to collect more Agony and Remnant. I know these ideas aren't all that good, because honestly I'm just spitting random ideas here and there, so they aren't going to be as good as something Scott could come up with. I'm sure Scott, Megacat Studios, and Steelwool would do a much better job of revamping and rebooting Eleanor and her story for the games, along with expanding upon it in much better and more satisfying ways. I mean, Megacat Studios already did a fantastic job of taking the yellow rabbit from Into the Pit and making it into a much more menacing and terrifying villain than the original story. So I'm sure if they ever worked on adding Eleanor into their next projects, they would do a much better job of fleshing her out and making her a much scarier and compelling villain. My main point though is that the concept of Eleanor and her character is very good and actually has a lot of potential. So I honestly think fans should give her more of a chance. Yes, her character and whole arc with the Stitch Rate Stingers was poorly done in the Fazbear Frights books, but I think she deserves a second chance to be rebooted for the games. I really hope to see her character and story get completely remade and brought to the games universe and timeline. I know Circus Baby is thought of by many, including myself, to be one of the best, most compelling, mysterious, and manipulative villains, especially in Sister Location, when she didn't seem to care much about her father in that game. Likewise, most of us were pretty disappointed by her sudden change in attitude to becoming more of a daddy's girl in Pizzeria Simulator and Fourth Closet. But with Eleanor, Scott has a chance to actually change things, to start fresh with a new take on the character, one not possessed by Elizabeth Afton or following in her father's wishes and becoming his pawn, but becoming more powerful evil and with her own plans, backstory, and motivation. I've always thought it was fascinating that Eleanor was described and drawn in such a way as having such a similar appearance to Circus Baby. I know that most people think that Lady Fizzy made her design look way too similar to Circus Baby in the early illustration of her, and while that indeed may be the case, Eleanor was still always described in the books as having green eyes, red hair tied into pigtails, candy apple red lips, pink cheeks, and a clown-like face, which still sounds pretty similar to Circus Baby and the more grown-up version of her in the Fourth Closet. So I've always suspected that her having a similar appearance to Baby could be relevant and somehow important. This is further backed by the description and pic of her in both the character encyclopedia and even more recently in the Return to the Pit interactive novel. Return to the Pit even takes it one step further by adding a red nose to her description, which was not in the Fazbear Frights novel's original description. I mean, if you take a step back and really look at Circus Baby and Eleanor, yes, they are described as having similar features and appearances, but they are really not the exact same person. They have very different personalities, but at the same time, they essentially represent the same character in different ways, while also being complete opposites in just about every single way. Circus Baby is huge. I mean, she's big, she's bulky, she's heavy. She was designed and made by William Afton to lure, trap, and kill kids in her stomach. She kills and is possessed by his daughter, Elizabeth Afton, who goes on to manipulate others, but she is not evil. Rather, she is easily corrupted and manipulated by her father to help him. On the other hand, though, Eleanor is shorter, petite, doll-like, She's much thinner with long metallic arms and legs. She's more lightweight and not possessed by any spirit, but she has black tendrils and is a chaotic, otherworldly, demonic creature. Therefore, she is purely evil and is out for herself with her own plans for power and immortality. As you can see, there's a lot of potential for Circus Baby and Eleanor to be connected in some way, but also still be their own separate and different beings. Regardless, there's so many possibilities with bringing Eleanor to the games and having them completely rebooting her story in a completely new way for the games. And judging by her recent appearance in Return to the Pit, as well as her cameos and voice lines for the Into the Pit game trailer, it seems like Scott might be bringing her into the games universe in some form or another. Whether that's in Mega Cat's own universe, with more Fazbear Fright stories being adapted into games set in their own timeline, separate from the main games, or whether it's completely rebooting Eleanor's character and bringing them into the main game's timeline like the Return to the Pit interactive novel seemed to hint at. Either way, I am super excited to see if Eleanor makes a comeback and seeing if Scott does anything with her character in the future. I firmly and honestly believe that she was done wrong and rushed in the books, and that she really does deserve another chance to shine in the main games. What about you guys? Do you agree or disagree? Did you read the novels? Did you like Eleanor? Did you hate her, or were you disappointed by how rushed her character was as well? Would you like to see her come to the main games in a rebooted and reimagined way? Or do you have any ideas on how you would incorporate her into the games? Let me know in the comments below. I'm really interested in hearing your ideas and theories as well. Well, that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, then please like and subscribe and comment as well. I'd love to hear from you. If you like this theory and want to see more, please check out my Silent Hill F and Ryukishi deep dive, prediction, and analysis video here. See you all next time.